Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel's President Isaac Herzog makes an historic appearance before the U.S. Congress in commemoration of Israel's 75th birthday. An expert weighs in on judicial reform and what it means for governments going forward. Plus, the World Health Organization puts out a plan of action for all 194 of its member states in case of a future pandemic. Why it's got some people worried. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israel's President Isaac Herzog swept through Washington, D.C. this week on a wave of friendship and support. He sought to reassure Congress about the state of Israel's democracy and the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and to receive congratulations on Israel's 75th birthday. The visit was not without its controversy, however. Critics of it pointed to the fact that the invite came to President Herzog and not Israel's elected Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. President Biden quieted that talk with a personal phone call to Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he tabled the idea of an official visit this fall. But in Congress, the welcome was warm, and President Herzog spoke of strengthening Israel's ties with the U.S.
Israel's first 75 years were rooted in an ancient dream. Let us base our next 75 years on hope, our shared hope that we can heal our fractured world as the closest of allies and friends. Thank you, members of both houses, for celebrating Israel's independence. Am Yisrael Chai. God bless the state of Israel, and God bless the United States of America.
President Herzog mentioned Israel's judicial reform debate in his address to Congress this week. Legal expert Jeff Balaban shared his insights with me about what judicial reform would entail. Jeff Balaban from the ACLJ, thanks for joining us. Tell us what this whole controversy about judicial reform is all about.
Thanks, Chris. Look, there's the reality of judicial reform, and there's the politics of judicial reform. So let's talk about the reality first, and maybe we'll also talk about the politics, because obviously this has become huge news. My father called me last night from America, worried about me because of protests. I said I was simply unaware where I am here in Jerusalem that there were protests, but it's being played in the media around the world and in America. Yeah. The reality is that judicial reform has been an issue that right and left have broadly agreed on for probably 30 years. Not exactly what reforms are needed, but the mainstream in Israel across the board understands there need to be reforms, and there's a simple reason. Starting in the late 80s, Justice Aaron Barak, then the president of the Supreme Court, and by the way, a professor of mine in law school, started aggregating power to the court, power unheard of in any free country in the world, something that Americans couldn't actually imagine. For example, there's a combination, there's no constitution, there's no written constitution, no balance of powers. So there's a combination of powers the court has taken for itself and no one can stop them. For example, there's no concept of standing or justiciability. And they have a concept of reasonableness. Now, what do those mean when you put them together? In America, in order to have a case come before a court, in order for them to have the power, the right to decide something, the case has to be justiciable. It means it has to be, someone has to be suffer for it, has to have standing to bring it to the court, and the court has to have the right to make the decision. Not everything is justiciable. They've wiped that out here. Literally anything is justiciable. At whose decision, at whose discretion? The courts itself. And they apply a doctrine called reasonableness. Now, reasonableness exists in other countries, but not like it does here. Here, what it means is a judge decides something's unreasonable and simply nullifies it. I'll give you an example because it's really hard for Americans to even conceive of what kind of power this is. The court here can nullify an election. The public votes on an individual. And the court says, well, I think it was unreasonable, in my opinion, there's no standard, the judge says, in my opinion, I think it was unreasonable for this person to be a candidate. And so call this whole election off. It doesn't matter what the people think. That's the least democratic thing imaginable, right? They have intervened in the Knesset's ability to even discuss legislation. No, you can't discuss this legislation. In the instant situation, they did something extraordinary. They issued, they didn't issue it. They upheld a statement or a ruling by what's the equivalent of the Attorney General here, but again, superpowers, that the head of the country, the head of the coalition, Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, could not express his views on the issue of judicial reform, could not engage in political speech. The most protected speech of all. So these powers are unheard of in America. And they want to simply restore a balance of powers or create a balance of powers. Now, is every reform going to be accepted by everybody? No. Should these reforms be debated? Yes. But instead, we get to the politics.
Up next, the connection between politics and the judicial reform protest. We'll hear more in part 2 of my interview with Jeff Balaban. Let's jump back into our conversation with Jeff Balaban about judicial reform. When we left off, he was saying there were underlying political motivations beneath the protests. Right now, the opponents of judicial reform are saying this is the end of democracy.
Right. And of course, we see this in America also, where the hard left, progressive left will use words to mean their opposite, to use freedom to mean the opposite, democracy to mean the opposite. We just had actually a congressman today declare that the problem is that Congress has too much power, and the power needs to, not these words, but needs to vest in the hands of the FBI and the IRS. That's a horrifying idea if you believe in freedom. So the politics here seems to be that outside groups who like ginning up, and there is credible evidence that money, plenty of it, is coming from outside the state of Israel, some of it coming from the United States, some of it credibly coming from the United States government, is going to foment these street demonstrations, we'll call them. They're not quite riots, but street demonstrations. Much as we've seen sort of international influence in trying to undermine the streets of America. And there's a movement that's trying to do that here. Mm-hmm. They found allies in those who oppose this coalition and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think those people who are going along with the statements that we've seen coming out of some former Israeli leaders, saying that the rest of the world should basically hold Israel in contempt.
Ehud Olmert has said that?
Olmert has said that, and Tzipi Livni and others, which is shocking. They're going out into other places in the world and basically saying that Israel should be ostracized and demonized and delegitimized. You know, it seems to me a very short-sighted approach to try and shatter the current coalition and then get Prime Minister Netanyahu out of office. But the damage they're doing to Israel's reputation abroad and to the coherence in civil society here seems to me just beyond compare.
Jeff, tell us about what some Supreme Court justices and judges have said about Israel's judiciary.
Sure. Over the decades, judges in America who care about the balance of powers and who care about preserving freedom and who fight judicial activism have pointed to Israel's court as by far the most egregious and aggressive grab of power. So, for example, I actually have a couple of quotes. Richard Posner, famous judge, he said, what Aaron Barak created out of whole cloth is a degree of judicial power undreamed of, even by our most aggressive Supreme Court justices. Robert Bork, the famous Robert Bork, he wrote a whole book with the chapters just dedicated to this in Israel, and he wrote that in Israel, the branch most dangerous to the political rights of the nation could be the Supreme Court. And Justice Scalia, with his usual wit, says that he reads Israeli Supreme Court decisions when I really want to be shocked and see my court isn't so bad after all. So this is a situation that judges who care about American freedom, they know this is needed.
And last question, do you also see the Biden administration weighing in on the opposition or with the opposition?
Well, we do. And the president has multiple occasions spoken about it. He's put pressure on Israel. And do I believe that Joe Biden understands the details of the reforms or the internal fact that all the polls show that a majority of Israelis, a solid majority of coalition voters and opposition voters, believe some reform is needed? No, I'm sure he doesn't know that. I'm sure the people who gave him his talking points don't. But they've activated the President of the United States to put pressure as though Israel is losing its democracy. It is not.
Would you say anything but? It's actually, this is part of democracy, bringing judicial reform?
Every reform that I've seen, and I have not read through every proposed reform, exactly seeks to emulate the United States' vision of a balance of powers and checks and balances. It's not perfect because there is no constitution here. So someone's going to have a little bit power, and we have to debate, Israel, not we, Israel has to debate which powers vest in which branches. But to simply say that to discuss this, to allow the will of the people to be heard over these unelected judges who have taken all this power and are using it in this way, it's outrageous. This is to preserve democracy, not to break it.
Jip Balaban with the ACLJ, thanks for explaining what's going on right now here in Israel.
Thank you, Chris. It's always a pleasure to be with you and CBN.
Coming up, the World Health Organization's agreement for all 194 of its member states for when the next pandemic hits, and why some experts are up in arms. The Dean of Regent University's Robertson School of Government, Michelle Bachmann, tells CBN News that the world's nations may be about to submit some of their sovereignty to a UN organization. As Paul Strand reports, Bachmann says it will be the first time that's happened in human history.
The attempted power grab described by Bachmann involves the World Health Organization, or WHO. Through a series of 307 amendments and a global pandemic treaty, the WHO seeks to gain authority over health decisions of UN member nations that could affect the rest of the world in the case of something like another COVID pandemic.
Then they would be empowered to tell us in America, we have to lock down. We have to shut down. We have to close our churches. We have to close our schools. We're forced, mandated to take a vaccine, whether we want to or not. We're forced to mask. We're forced to whatever it is that they tell us that we have to do. We have never before in history, in 5,000 years of recorded human history, we've never seen this level of authority given to an international global body.
Those supporting this authority for the WHO, such as top advisor Dr. Abdullah Asiri, say it's necessary to protect the world's population, even if it means restricting some of their liberties.
The world, however, requires a different level of legal mandates, such as the pandemic treaty, to navigate through a particular pandemic, should one occur, and it will. Prioritizing actions that may restrict individual liberties, mandating and sharing of information, knowledge and resources, and pandemic control efforts are all necessary during a pandemic.
Let us seize this opportunity to foster international collaboration, ensure global health security, and protect the lives and the well-being of all people beyond boundaries.
Bachmann sees little to no opposition from nations' top leaders in handing over this power starting next year.
I don't think all the nations fully understand what these implications are, so we have very little time.
And top backers of this United Nations move do say speed is of the essence.
And I wish to stress, from our perspective, the quicker we can come together, the sooner we will all be safe. We know that the challenges we face won't be solved by a few leaders or a few countries, but by the world coming together and fighting for what's right.
Some in Congress oppose this move to further empower the WHO. They've proposed legislation that would deem it a treaty. A treaty would require Senate approval. Bachmann, however, claims the White House is trying an end run around these lawmakers.
The Biden administration doesn't plan to bring this treaty back to the U.S. Senate because they're using a subterfuge. They're calling it not a treaty, they're calling it an accord. And they're saying this isn't a treaty, this is just an accord, we can do this, we don't need the involvement of the U.S. government. But once you give government and power away, it's very hard to get it back.
The former Congresswoman points out the Bible warns world-dominating power will bring trouble.
When you look at what the Bible says and the convergence of events that we are seeing across the world right now and what the prophets from the Bible have said, we need to really pay attention to what's going on, because this is the creation of a platform for global government. And according to the Bible, things that are not good come out of a global government.
Supporters of the World Health Organization and this planned accord say critics like Bachmann worry too much. The nations won't really lose sovereignty. It remains to be seen, though, just how powerful the WHO will become if these new emergency powers are granted and another pandemic hits. Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, she's helped hundreds of Jewish couples tie the knot. And she's the star of a hit Netflix show. We talk to the Jewish matchmaker when we get back. In the race for global military dominance, the use of artificial intelligence on the battlefield is both a major and potentially scary goal. Experts testified before U.S. lawmakers recently on its capabilities, on AI's capabilities and best practices for using machines to save military lives. Brody Carter brings us the story.
Attempting to make laws that put in safeguards for AI, legislators discussed three potential outcomes of using AI in combat. First, it could increase the destructive power of modern warfare. Second, AI also has the potential to lessen that power. And finally, the possibility that machines could unilaterally take power and go beyond our ability to control them.
The country that is able to most rapidly and effectively integrate new technology into warfighting wins.
Founder and CEO of Scale AI, Alex Wang, says the U.S. is already behind in the artificial intelligence race.
China is investing the full power of its industrial base for AI. This year, they're on track to spend roughly 3 times the U.S. government on AI.
And he should know because the Pentagon is a major customer. It awarded his company, Scale AI, a $250 million contract to help the U.S. military develop and deploy AI technology, including a decision-making tool called Donovan and robotic combat vehicles.
Intelligence algorithms have made data significantly more valuable than they have in the past. Everyone within the DoD needs to understand that data is actually the ammunition in an AI war.
Wang testified Tuesday that the U.S. should combine military data with current AI technology to establish a foundation for long-term success. The Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office is a relatively new defense branch responsible for training artificial intelligence models, developing new military capabilities, and conducting threat analysis while making decisions, including the taking of human life.
It's certainly true that most of the exquisite capabilities that the DoD looks to build are likely to be developed at the secret or top secret level.
And without that development, experts agree the U.S. risks losing global influence, tech leadership, and democracy to strategic adversaries, including China.
And it's really important that your government and industry work together to realize those promises and to mitigate those threats.
As lawmakers work to bolster the military's artificial intelligence.
So this is a genie that can't be put back in the bottle.
Others warn average Americans need to prepare for a changed workforce.
And what's interesting about AI is that the jobs it is going to replace are not factory workers and industrial workers as much as white-collar workers. And so we need to start thinking about what impact will that have on our society and what are these new jobs that might be created as a result of this.
Education is key because some lawmakers admittedly don't even know what Twitter does, let alone the capabilities of artificial intelligence. For those making laws to govern AI, the key is quickly implementing this technology while also keeping it controlled as the U.S. fights to keep up with China. Brody Carter, CBN News.
The Netflix dating show Jewish Matchmaking is all about faith, love, and marriage. It follows singles in the U.S. and Israel as they turn to a professional matchmaker to help them tie the knot. We spoke to the matchmaker herself, Eliza Ben Shalom, about how Jews and Christians alike can find true love. Well, Eliza Ben Shalom, thanks for joining us on CBN News. Tell me more about the Jewish matchmaker, and let me preface it by saying we met at the wedding of a friend, David Rubin. His daughter was getting married. We saw the film crew there for Netflix, and we were interested and began a conversation that was actually recorded. So we have a bit of a cameo in the very beginning of The Jewish Matchmaker, and I've gotten a number of people that have said, hey, Chris, did you know you're on The Jewish Matchmaker? Elisa, tell us the reaction you've had from when the series came out.
There's been an unbelievably positive response. People have been very excited to see Jewish people from all different ages and stages and backgrounds. And it's been very exciting for us to see different representation of Jewish people.
When you think of matchmaking, what are some of the biblical examples or maybe even, principles, I would say, that you could look to?
We have the story of, first we have Adam and Eve, which is kind of God's first match where they're really together, they're kind of one, and then they're, separated into two. We also have Abraham, who sent out his servant Eliezer to go find a wife for his son. And he was asking, please, can I have some divine assistance? This is the hardest job in the world. How am I going to know who's the right girl? And I think that asking for divine assistance is a part of the process, and we see other relationships that come together where there's something that happened. They meet, there's an interaction, but what we understand is that, and then he came to love her, something like that, where we understand that it's not about I love you and therefore I should marry you. It's I picked you, you're my person, and I will come to love you, and we will develop this beautiful relationship over time.
What are some of the criteria that you look out that you look for that would make a match?
We are looking for personalities to match up where there's something sweet between people. We want to know that people's long, medium, and short-term values are in alignment. So we want to know that they are heading in a similar direction, and also to make sure in terms of things like fears or things that in general might be a trigger for somebody or maybe a trauma from the past, that they're not heavily triggered, that there's not a lot of friction that's between people, so that we know that they have the ability to stay married.
Now, you're the Jewish matchmaker. Are there universal principles for Christians, for other people?
Absolutely. First of all, I would tell you that faith-based matchmaking is very similar because we all have a belief in a higher power. We all have a connection to our religion, and those things are very similar when we're looking to make a match, how we want to raise a family, how we want to raise our children, what types of schools we want to send them to, what type of foundational information we want to give them to help them live productive, happy, healthy lives.
So anything you'd want to add, Elisa, that I haven't asked?
The one thing I like to do is to leave people with a blessing. I usually like to tell people, may each and every one of you find somebody wonderful. May it happen with ease, and may it happen this year.
Well, Elisa, thanks for joining us. That's a wonderful blessing to end with. God bless.
Thank you. God bless. Thank you.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.
이 프로그램은 여러분의 미디어 선교 후원으로 제작되었습니다. 선교는 사명, 후원은 동역. 당신도 복음을 전할 수 있습니다. 선교 후원 02-6333-1003번